Cool, it's awesome to be in Paris. Thanks so much for the guys organising the drinks last night. That was really good fun. But I was a bit shocked, €8 for a beer. So now I know why all the French people drink wine. So it's either that or you saw the two English guys pitch up and thought, these guys will do anything for a bit of beer. So I think I'm going to be on the wine from now on. So my name is John Cleveley. I'm a tech lead at BBC News. I've been on with the BBC for about 2.5 years. I started off on BBC iPlayer, that is their video on demand system, and now work on the responsive news project. It's about a team of about 10 of us, and we released our first product earlier this year in January. So I'm going to talk about how we built our responsive site. And for the BBC, it was a massive change. So we're talking about going from quite an old tech system, moving BBC News to PHP, and also going to responsive on the front end. So a big change. So this is kind of all about sharing some of the lessons we've learned and how also we've used some of the Symfony stuff as well. And also, like, why we bothered in the first place. You know, responsive design is quite a buzzword at the moment, so I'm kind of going to go through about why we actually decided that that was a good idea. So a little bit of background. This is the existing desktop site, and it's pretty old school. So we're talking about a statically published site. So when the journalists create a story, basically what happens, we have a velocity template, and then that gets stored in a file system. And then when someone requests the page, we actually use SSIs to include different parts of the page. So it's really old tech, and nobody wants to work on it, and we kind of want to modernize it and bring everything to a dynamic stack. So that sometimes when you search for a BBC News article that's actually quite old, you will actually see a different header and footer because it's actually been statically published about 10 years ago. So we're hoping to kind of, with the responsive news site, we're hoping to refresh the whole tech stack. So I'm going to kind of go into the responsive side of things, and to kind of go through why we thought this approach was good, we kind of need to take a step back and kind of time travel back to the good old days in 2006. So back then, stuff was really simple. We had two categories of devices. At one end of the scale, we had mobile stuff, which has got, we're talking small screens and very, very low capability. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got desktop with awesome browsers and massive screens that we can just throw content at, and it's going to look really, really cool. And for humans, it's really easy for us to compartmentalize these two different things. So we ended up with the products that we've got at the moment. So on the left, we've got our super duper desktop with great user experience site, and our kind of a little bit naff mobile site that kind of does the job. You know, there's some content in there. It works, and it's kind of designed for really, really small screens, but doesn't take advantage of the massive capability of mobile devices. So the way the BBC was organized as well was these two different tech stacks with two completely different teams. So we were reinventing the wheel over and over again. And there were two different stacks as well. And then we basically had, between 2006 and 2012, a massive explosion in the amount of devices that we had to cater for. And for the BBC, with a limited budget, you know, this is a complete nightmare. So we kind of had to think what we're going to do. So we had all sorts of stuff. You know, you've got small devices, little squashed devices. We've got massive TVs. This is the IPTV, BBC News, and stuff like the Xbox new Internet Explorer stuff as well. You've got really slow connections as well. Poor guy in the field, you know, he's on GPRS. He's not going to be happy with a 1 megabyte page load. And then you've got the other side of the spectrum. You've got the super new 4G phones. And this is probably quicker than my broadband at home. You've got devices that are tactile and a very, very high resolution screen. You've got black and white screens with quite a limited capability browser. You've got, oh, I missed her. Oh, no. Go back to the beginning again. You've got expensive Macs, which have got very, very good capability. But to be honest, if you measure how many people are actually using these devices, then it's not as geeks and developers, we love Macs and we've got really expensive. But in the real world, not many people are actually using them. And you've got the old favorite, embedded devices as well, that kind of never really caught on. And to make things even more complicated, the features of these devices are not mutually exclusive. So for example, one device at one moment can be super thin, you can rotate it, and then it's wide, and it changes everything. You can have different speeds. So I often tether my laptop to my phone, so I can be on my laptop and have a really, really slow connection, but I'm still offered a desktop experience, and vice versa. I could be on my mobile phone and have a very, very quick connection speed. And so these things make the whole development process very, very complicated. So basically, this whole assumption is broken, okay? The mobile web, as we know it, doesn't really exist. The spectrum is much wider than just little mobile phones and big desktop browsers. So in reality, it looks something more like this, where we've got a fragmented devices across lots of different axes. So not only is it about the capability and the screen size, we're also talking about the connection speed, the resolution. So we're talking about Retina that have got double the resolution of other screens, and how we actually adapt the experience for that. And the input method. So some things are touch, some things are voice, some things are mouse. And how on earth do we actually cater for all these different inputs? So globally, mobile devices, we're talking about 10% of traffic. But a country like India, in the last quarter, mobile internet is actually overtaken desktop. So this stuff is super important. If we're giving suboptimal websites to mobile users, we're going to lose money. For the BBC, we're going to lose page views, and we're not going to be able to communicate the news to the broadest number of people. And so, to quickly look at the spread of sales of phones in the last quarter, the biggest proportion is simple mobile phones, and only about a sixth of those are smartphones. So when we're looking at designing, we're not just talking about iOS and Android. And these small phones have big expectations. The users have got a big expectation of what they want to see. But these stats are complete nonsense, okay? We don't use these stats. It's really important to understand what devices your visitors are using. So we have a weekly stats, and we're always making sure that in our cupboard, we've got every device over 2% of the traffic that we can test against. And it's really important to understand what specific devices your country or your particular service requires, because it's going to be very different from the BBC News. And even in BBC, iPlayer, which is concerned with video, has a very different statistics to BBC News that is basically just text and images. And to complicate things a little bit further, lots of these very basic phones run Opera Mini and Opera Mobile. I'm sure you're all aware that this is an awesome piece of engineering. Basically, it works on really, really old kit, and they render the page on a proxy server, saving you connection speed. So for us, this is one of our biggest mobile browsers. And so there's lots of quirks and lots of funny JavaScript going on, and it's really important to kind of test against that browser. So we need to adapt. We can't continue with this mobile phone, desktop kind of approach. and we need to provide a different experience for the different devices. And not only that, at the BBC, we kind of had to reorganize ourselves. So in our team, which is about 10 or 8 developers, we've got an embedded designer and an embedded tester, and we work closely together. And when you've got all these devices, it's impossible to create a Photoshop file and throw it over the wall, because it's far more complex than that. And as well with testing, we used to have a process where you couldn't release anything unless it's past QA, and that was a 2-week period. But now it's up to the developers to make sure it works. And we have one manual tester who's genius with mobile phones and kind of just double checks that everything's okay. So it's not about just adapting our development stuff, it's more of a culture thing as well. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more in the future. And the other really important thing is speed. So the BBC has a lot of users in developing countries, but also in the UK and in France, some of the connections are really, really poor. And so when we're adapting things, where it's really important, we could add all this stuff to the page that we're keeping the speed really, really quick. So, like, the easiest thing to do would be to create a bespoke website for every single device. So we've got a tablet, so let's create an iPad site. We've got TV, let's create a TV site. And the problem with that, even with Google, one of their chief engineers have basically said, we can't afford this. And with the BBC, we definitely can't afford it. We've got really limited resources. And so it simply doesn't scale. And the number of devices are going to keep on growing, and the variety of the different requirements are going to get larger. So with the current approach, we're really struggling to maintain the actual speed of development. Cool, that's my cue for a drink. Sorry? What's his name? Fat, I think. Fat Cat. We started using GitHub, and when we do a pull request, we have to put a funny animated GIF at the top, otherwise no one pulls it. So I was just taking a selection of the best ones. Okay, so what's the magic answer? And basically, there's lots of options. So the first kind of question is, how do we work out what device your user is on? And there's kind of 2 schools of thought, and they're both valid, and they've both got pros and cons depending on the site you're developing and the users that you're serving. So we've got server-side device detection and client-side. So on the server side, basically, I don't know if you're all aware of Wordful, which is a massive database of user agents. And so we can look up a particular user agent string from the header and work out what mobile phone it is, what the browser is, and some of the capabilities as well. And then we can either be lazy and set a cookie so we know, or you can redirect to a different site, or if you're using something like Varnish, you can just vary on a particular device ID. And that's good, and that's the kind of approach that LinkedIn use. So they've got 2 very distinct products with their mobile and their desktop, and they're very, very different, and that's worked really well for them. And then on the client side, which is the approach that Boston Globe have used and at BBC News. And so every single user, whatever device you're on, gets the same initial markup. And then on the JavaScript, it's just a matter of detecting the screen size, detecting JavaScript features, and then scaling content to fit the screen, and then further enhancing. So for example, making additional XHR requests to bring in more content. And for example, if you've got a feature on the phone like geolocation, bring in JavaScript then. So you're lowering the initial hit and kind of lazy loading stuff. So the key point is that everybody gets the same markup, which is great for back-end devs, because it's like, there you go, that's it, and it completely simplifies the back end. And for CDN as well. So at the BBC News, if we have a problem with our infrastructure, someone throws a switch and it shoots off to a CDN. And that makes the whole process a lot easier. Unfortunately, it makes the front end, the JavaScript, the CSS, quite complicated. So is responsive design like this silver bullet? It's not, but it's worked for the BBC News. And so it's kind of, it's great because it's completely device independent. And there's kind of no more of this massive Photoshop files that developers used to get. And so instead, we've got flexible layouts, media queries, and then we can completely adapt the content to the device. So responsive design gives us some key advantages. We're splitting ourselves into feature teams, which means that we can develop a feature across all devices and release it in one go. Before, we would have this problem where we would release a feature for desktop and our iOS app or our Android app would have to catch up. And there's this, the problem where we haven't got this content parity and features were all over the place. And so responsive design is going to fix that. And also, because we've chosen not to use the Wordful database, when new devices come out, hopefully things will just work because we can work out how big your screen is and we don't have to rely on your user agent string. So it's far more maintainable. And the problem with the Wordful approach and the server-side approach is that it almost becomes an arms race in that you're waiting for a third party to upgrade their database if a new device comes out. And if it doesn't recognize, then they're going to get a suboptimal website to view when they've got a very, very capable phone. And it's one code base, which is going to make, as developers, our lives a lot easier. And it's hosted on one single URL, which is making the CDN and the architecture a lot more simple. Instead of having lots of subdomains, which makes things quite tricky, especially with things like JavaScript, hosting things on a single URL, we can push things up to a CDN, and it makes things a lot more simple. So responsive design isn't anything new, particularly. It kind of comes down to these really old approaches that we all kind of know. You know, mobile first. What's the content about? What's important for the user, especially if they're on a small screen? And then progressive enhancement. How can we make this even better and make best use of the features on the phone? So it's all about the content, and then we're using media queries and JavaScript to enhance the experience. So this is kind of like most websites, right? You've kind of got the content in the middle, and you've got this rubbish around the edges, and then you've got some JavaScript, a lot of JavaScript, and some jQuery plugins, and then you've got to wait slowly for the page to load. Wouldn't it be great if instead of that, it was just about the content, right? That's what really matters. And that's kind of the crux of responsive design, working out what the content is and what they need to know. That sounds really easy, but it really isn't, because mobile users want to do things that desktop users want to do, but there's no space. And so it's a really hard design process to go through. So the target is to get content parity between the different platforms. I know I get really annoyed if I'm on the couch on my phone and I'm on a site on my mobile and it says, to do this, you need to go to the desktop. I mean, that's just a fail. It really is a fail. That should be available no matter what device you're on. You just have to access it in different ways. But it really isn't easy. Say we've got like 80 browsers across lots of mobile phones. How on earth do we test this? Some of these really old phones have got really, really bad JavaScript. engines. And how do we we've only got limited resources, and what do we do about that? So what we do at the BBC News is split the browsers between two. On one side, we have the good browsers that we give an enhanced experience to. And on the other side, we've got the bad browsers that we give a core experience to, but have got access to all the same content as the enhanced version. And this is kind of just progressive enhancement, right? It's nothing new. But it gets over the problem of being able to test all the devices. So we kind of decided to just draw a line in the sand. You know, we've got our HTML4 old stuff, we've got our HTML5, and this is where we're going to concentrate our effort. So we kind of ended up something like this. So on the left-hand side, we've got enhanced. On the right, we have our core. And it's the same content in both. But we enhance the HTML5 version. So we lazy load images. We add JavaScript to get relative dates. We lazy load the tabs with preloaded content. And on the core side, we've got the same content and it's still available, but without the JavaScript, without the testing on core phones. So this gives us one big win, okay? The core experience is really, really quick. You know, you're on your phone on GPRS and you go to our site and it's bang. It's just there. So we've really kind of stripped down the core experience to what the user needs. And we kind of got it down to, you know, just a touch over 20K. So it's really, really lightning quick. So what is the trick? How do we decide what is a good browser and what is a bad browser? And so this is our cuts the mustard test, which basically is it any good? So we do some quick JavaScript tests. We work out if the browser has query selector, and if we've got local storage and add event listener. So that's kind of gives us a kind of ballpark of that it's going to be quite a good browser. So this helps us avoid downloading large DOM libraries. Because this is we're talking about text and images. It's not a complex site. We're not developing a massive CRM backend system. So we can afford to keep things really, really lightweight. And our test kind of helps us keep down the libraries that we're using. And so we kind of, instead of using something like jQuery, we kind of rely on the native features of modern browsers. So we don't have to use polyfills, etc. So the great thing is that most browsers actually still pass. And against our stats, you know, things are looking good for the browsers that we're using. And the great plus is that it kind of reduces our development time. So we can spend more time on new features for the best browsers and still giving a good quality, fast core experience for the older devices that people would still use. So I'm going to go through a few different techniques that we use in our team to help kind of enhance the experience. So the first thing is images. So images are a massive part of our page weight, far outweighing anything else on the page. And so they're still talking at W3C about responsive images and having different images and different sizes. And so until that actually happens, we basically mark everything 100% width. And so it will scale automatically to the container, which is great. The only downside is that the browser doesn't actually know the size of the image until it receives it. And at that point, the browser will have to redraw the page. But it's pros and cons, okay? You know, I think it's better to have a nice scaled image and take the hit. So what do we do with the images? We basically have two strategies. We've got a tool on our server that's able to resize the images on the fly. And so for the core experience, we give it quite a small image, and then we add a class. The JavaScript then passes over those tags, fetching a larger image based on the screen size of the device. So if you're an iPad with a nice retina screen, you want a really juicy quality image. And so then we basically take out the old image and put the new one in. And for example, on the core website, the core experience, when we don't have any images, we basically have an empty div, and we add an HTML5 attribute of the source of the image, and again, replacing the width of the image, and so that we can get a much better quality for the device. And this kind of helps the speed as well, because stuff is kind of getting lazy loaded. People can see the content, the text, as soon as they hit the page, and then we're enhancing it later. And so this is another example where we preload markup. So we link to the same content for the core experience. So if you're on an old phone, you'd click most read, and you'd go to a separate page. And so on an enhanced phone, we kind of AJAX that in, using the same back-end controller, just detecting whether it's an XHR request or not, and loading in that content. Menus are quite interesting when it comes to devices, and this is probably the biggest problem with design, with the hardest issue with design. And so on the left, you've kind of got a menu which is geared up for mobile, and on the right, geared up for more of the tablet size. But things can kind of very quickly get out of hand. You know, you can grab a lot of content from the server. CSS, JavaScript, images, just plain HTML. And this is a real problem for mobile phones. Like making lots of HTTP requests on GPRS is bad. And so optimizing is really, really important. And the goal is to make fewer requests and make these requests really, really small. And the easiest thing to do is make sure all your content is gzipped. And this is, especially with Apache, just adding deflate, and it's super easy. And you're talking, it makes the content a lot smaller. Easy things that you all know about: concatenating your JavaScript and CSS, using CSS sprites, again, having lots of little logos and making separate HTTP requests is really, really bad. And this is really interesting: third-party plugins. I kind of found out that the Facebook like button is actually massive. It's like 80K, and it takes about over a second to download. And so it's really important to kind of keep an eye on what all these pieces of JavaScript are doing on your page and monitoring them to make sure that your users are not getting a bad experience because of another company's work. So we decided to render all our markup on the server. We kind of felt that it keeps stuff really, really simple. And for non-JavaScript browsers, it just works. And for Google bots and search bots, they can easily access and index all of our pages. And we keep all our templates in one place. You know, we haven't got any duplication between JavaScript templating and server-side templating. I don't know if you've seen, but Twitter have recently kind of changed their strategy. So they've gone back to using more server-side rather than using Moustache on the client side. And they've saved about 20% on their load times, which is pretty good. At BBC News as well, we have quite a lot of translations. And it's far easier to kind of deal with these different languages on the server. So we have about 27 different languages across the world. And it makes it a lot easier, rather than sending loads of content down the wire to the browser. Cool, is that timing again? I don't know if it survived. It kind of gets funnier the more you look at it. Poor cat. Cool, so that's kind of responsive design and how we've approached it, some of the techniques we've used to help us develop the stuff. So I'm just going to talk about some of the tools that we used along the way. So this is kind of like our toolbox of stuff we use. We use all sorts of different bits. we try and automate everything. Anything that I do twice, we write a script to do it, making our lives a lot easier. And especially as our team grows, that's going to pay dividends. So I'm just going to take a few of these and kind of talk through them. So Varnish is like, hallelujah. I don't know what we did before Varnish or why it was so difficult before, but basically we get about 10 times the performance with Varnish in front of our servers. So we tend not to use memcache and basically rely on HTTP caching. And that's kind of made our back-end stuff a lot simpler to debug and to get your head around what's working and reducing the number of caching layers in your system. So Varnish, we basically add some annotations as well. So when the request comes into BBC, we kind of work out where you're from and get some details and annotate the header and then send it back to the PHP layer. So we've got a service architecture. So as a PHP developer, JavaScript developer, I only deal with APIs. And so the service layer has got a content store it's a MarkLogic XML thing. That comes back. We add a Xcache control, fills up in Varnish, and so then that request is available when we get 8 million unique users per day, and when we get a lot of users. And Varnish basically protects us from the massive onslaught of requests. So something big happens in news, then Varnish basically helps to protect us from massive, massive spikes. So the architecture at the BBC is slightly more complicated than that. We've also got ZTM traffic managers between all the different layers to manage the traffic, and also Varnish. So we've got Varnish between the user and the front-end PHP, and Varnish between the PHP and the Java backend as well. So we use Zen framework at BBC. Don't throw things at me. It was before I came. It kind of works. It's a bit clunky, but it kind of does the job. So one of my kind of aims is to try and modernize the framework and how we use it. And this is kind of where our Symfony comes in. So there's a talk later on about how to use Symfony components on legacy code. And so that's kind of what we want to do. We want to kind of migrate parts and to kind of modernize some of the aspects of Zen framework without doing it in one massive go, because it's too complicated and it's very expensive for a large organization like the BBC. So one of the first things we tried to do with Zen framework was introduce dependency injection to help with testing. And Pimple, which you probably know from Silex, the micro framework, was awesome. You know, it's really quick, really easy for some of the developers for them to understand how it works. And it is really interesting to see the change in behavior of developers and actually seeing them starting using really, really good practices. And it's really straightforward to set up with Zen framework. So we've got, this is basically our bootstrap, and we basically create the container, create some services, and then attach it to the Zen front controller. And then in the controllers itself, we can just grab the container wherever we like. And so that's actually really, really quick to do. Another component that we started using is the awesome event dispatcher. Kind of going from PHP, then to JavaScript, and then going back to PHP again, kind of like really opened my mind in terms of event-driven stuff. And so it's been really good to start to decouple some of our components out. And for things like logging, that kind of happens throughout the whole system, the event dispatcher has really, really cleaned up our code. The only negative is that there's lots of stuff kind of hidden away. It's like sometimes difficult to work out what is actually going on. So to plug it into Zen framework, we've basically hijacked a front controller plugin, and we dispatch events off those methods that it provides. So we can get hooks into the system, similar to how Symfony Framework 2 works. And so I've kind of got really kind of big expectations of how we're going to slowly migrate things, parts of the system, over to Symfony components. And I really love this idea of small aspects you can just replace with other things and decoupled. And for large organizations where we can't afford to replace the whole thing, instead doing it in little chunks is really, really awesome. So I'm kind of looking forward to using the class loader, using Twig, using the config, and starting getting things plugged in, but slowly. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the JavaScript stuff. I kind of mentioned that we don't actually rely on many DOM libraries. We try and use micro libraries, quite small JavaScript components, which kind of supports our idea of a lightweight page. And sending code to the client that they're actually only going to use. So jQuery is about 35K, most of it about animations and IE6 support, things we don't really need. And not relying on a particular framework, so we can interchange different libraries. So it's the same philosophy as Symfony components, really, but for JavaScript. And it kind of applies for both. So the guys at Twitter, Dustin Diaz, has created quite a lot of really good little libraries. So we have one for Ajax, one for like selector wrapper, which kind of wraps around the native functionality in browsers. Bonzo, that wraps is a DOM utility. Event emitter, a thing called PubSub. And curl, which is an AMD JavaScript loader. As I mentioned, a responsive design kind of really pushes the complexity from the back end to the front end. So one of the new approaches that we try and do is AMD, which is in JavaScript, and it's called asynchronous module definition. And you might better know it from require.js. And so curl.js is basically another loader which are for the same specification. And it manages our dependencies in the JavaScript. So we can basically write very, very small chunks of code instead of the monolithic JavaScript files that we used to have, and compile it down to a single JavaScript file. And sometimes we have pages that have their own specific JavaScript. So then we would also have a secondary file which compiles. And so require.js kind of manages all those dependencies for us. It works out the mapping between the modules. So how does AMD look? This is kind of one of the global methods that it provides. You have define, which lets you actually specify modules. And at the top, you basically give an array of the dependencies. So this is where micro libraries are really cool, because you can just pick the dependencies you want, and then they're sandboxed within the module. So there's no more global JavaScript. These dependencies are then mapped to arguments in the function, and then we basically write our code, whether it be a function, an object, whatever, and return it. So this has basically allowed us to write quite complicated JavaScript in a maintainable manner. And so we can kind of, we scale the group of number of people working on the site, this is a really, really good way of maintaining your JavaScript. So I just want to show you one more thing. We do quite a lot of behavioral-driven development, so we're quite big on Cucumber. So when we work on a sprint, we'll do a 2-week sprint, and we'd have a meeting with the product owner, we would get a tester, a designer, and some of the developers together, and then write the scenarios all together. And then we would go about actually writing the code. But one problem we kind of came against was that it was really hard to communicate those scenarios to the product owner and people that aren't technical. So we came up with a little side project called Wally that is on GitHub. Feel free to fork it. that basically looks at all your scenarios and kind of makes a nice website for you. And so if you're someone that's not technical and you want to see what the system is actually doing, you kind of log in and you can, at an instant, see a living document of what the BBC News website is actually doing and what we're kind of working on in the future. So some final thoughts. I realise there's quite a lot of information there, but the main points to take away is speed is really, really important. When I first started web development, we kind of were worried about old 56K modems and stuff like that. So it's almost like we're going back to basics in terms of the speed really matters, the size of your page really matters, and understanding that not everybody is on a super fast broadband. And so responsive design is really, really good, but it's not the only answer. I'll say LinkedIn have a different approach. And so it's working out what works for you, but we've had great success with it. So what's next? We haven't figured it all out. Like, responsive design is really hard for advertising. You know, how do we improve the advertising for our international users? But I'm really excited getting the Symfony components plugged in. I'm really looking forward to getting maybe some Twig templating, some of the class loader stuff plugged in. And yeah, it's really good to start becoming part of the community. But thanks for listening. I presume we're having questions, but yeah, thanks a lot.